Hey class, we are going to talk about sonority and sonority principles and how they're related to syllables in our never-ending discussion on syllables. I promise we will eventually end our lectures on syllables and talk about something else. But for today, we're going to talk about sonority. All right, so let me share my screen with you and let me get this to the beginning. Okay, so as I mentioned, when we're talking about syllable trees, we can divide syllables up based on phonological segments. And we just did that in our last lecture. But today we're going to talk about sonority and how that relates to syllables. Okay. So the sonority principle says that sounds have different degrees of resonance. Okay, so sonority is referring to the loudness of sounds relative to other sounds. Um, and it's also, as you could see, if you look at how it is organized, sonority gets greater the wider the vocal tract is and the more open it is. So consider the more we get vowel-like, the more sonority a sound has. So voice with stops are furthest away, right, from being a vowel because you're completely closed, completely constricted to create the stop. Where as we move up, going from voiceless to voiced and then fricatives to nasals to liquids, right, we're going further and further up. Our vocal tract is getting wider and wider as we get towards the vowels. Okay, I did not mean to raise my hands. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, so as you can see here, affricates are not on here. So when you think about where you would put them. Um, so when you think about how an affricate is produced. So what do we know about affricates? Well, we know that an affricate is produced, right, first more like a stop and then like a fricative, right? So affricates, although they're not on this chart, if we were going to add them in, they'd probably be here after stops, but before fricatives. Okay? So just so you know. All right. So let me, um, I just wanted to point out on this chart the terminology sonorants, because we talked about this before, right? So we talked about how sounds could be broken up into different classes, and this is one of the classes, is sonorants. So these sounds, right, are much more vowel-like than the top half of our IPA chart here for consonants. Okay. So let's talk about the sonority principle and how it looks in graph form, because we're going to be drawing this ourselves. So it says that languages prefer that syllables build in this format. So in an orderly way, and you see this, it kind of looks like a mountain peak. So the nucleus of the syllable should be the vowel. You know this from when we're talking about syllables. So let's say we're starting with a consonant, and then we're moving up in seniority, where that's the peak is the vowel. And then after that vowel, it should be declining. Okay. So um, we should always be moving in that direction of increasing to the vowel and then decreasing after the vowel. So let's practice and see what this looks like. But before we do that, this is something the book did not talk about, but I think it's important for you to recognize because it's a very important principle, is that there are exceptions or violations of the sonority principle. And those exceptions or violations are the S clusters. So um, in literature around this principle, some SLPs or linguists will refer to them as adjunct clusters. but they're not even true clusters because they violate the sonority principle. So the sound plus a voiceless stop, so sp, sk, and st, all violate the sonority principle. And that's because the onset before the vowel is not rising in sonority. It's actually falling between that fricative sound and a voiceless stop. So that's violating principle. If this happens also in the coda, so the final consonant combination also causes a rise in sonority after the vowel, that is also going to violate the sonority principle. So developmentally, this is what children learn. Children learn language by listening to patterns in our speech. So because the sonority principle it's almost actually universal among languages, children will pick up on that pattern, right? So you will see that children will reduce consonant clusters to preserve the sonority principle. So for example, the word stop will often be produced as top, and that preserves the sonority principle. More complex consonant clusters, if you look at development, are the last to develop as well. So developmentally, this is the last thing to come in because it doesn't follow the principles of most languages. Also, when children are learning new words, they will often learn words that follow the sonority principle before they learn words that don't. So just so you know how this ties into language and speech development. Okay, so let's look at what this looks like when there's a violation. So instead of having this nice onset nucleus coda, we have this decline in the onset. And then because there is this voiceless fricative at the end of the word spots, we have from the to this also increasing, which we do not want as well. So this is an example of a violation and how it would be mapped out onto a chart. So I also, the book didn't talk about this, but again, as a clinician, I want you to be aware that you will be seeing this again. So there is a therapy method that's very well researched, that's based on the sonority principle, and specifically related to consonant clusters. So it's called the maximal opposition theory, and it's was researched heavily by this researcher Geroot. And what it does is it targets later developing sounds with the idea that they will generalize across the entire sound system to sounds that are easier to produce. So, as I just said, the consonant clusters are the most difficult for children. So what this therapy method does is it looks at that sonority principle and it picks the targets based on it. So when you study this, when you eventually are in an articulation disorders class, I want you to remember, oh yeah, we learned about the sonority principle in phonetics, and it will seem familiar to you. But again, even in this particular therapy method, which uses clusters and the sonority principle, the clusters that are the rule breakers that do not follow the sonority sequence are not used because it shows that these do not generalize across the language system because they're not following that sonority principle. Okay. So, as we said, this is a preference in our language and other languages. So let's map it out and see for these two words what it looks like. Okay, so we're going to start with the word pie. So if we were going to draw this out, first of all, you don't have to memorize the scale. The scale is going to be provided for you if you are asked a question, which you will be asked a question on a future quiz or test. Whoops, sorry about that. It will be provided for you. You should have a general idea of which direction it goes in, right? But you don't have to memorize it. So in this example, the P is, right, the voice of stop. So the lowest sonority on the scale. So we start here. And then the I is a vowel. So that's going to be way up here, right? up at the top. So we have this nice graphic representation of how this word is following the sonority principle. Now, this is an open syllable because there is no coda here. So it doesn't violate the principle. It just happens to be an open syllable. So your mouth would naturally close after you say pie. Okay, so let's look at another word and a different syllable structure here. Okay, so the word tough. So similar to how we drew out our trees, first thing we always want to do is put the word into IPA. So if we put it into IPA, once again, we have this stressed central vowel, so we are transcribing it with this symbol instead of the schwa. So again, we have a stop here, so that's going to be the lowest sonority, and then we have our vowel. So this is a central vowel, so it's not all the way up to the top as the other vowel in the last example, but it is, we have this nice high peak, and then we're back down here for our fricative sound, which is 3 on our sonority scale. So this does follow the sonority principle. Now, this is a closed syllable because we have this consonant after the vowel. Unlike the last example that we saw where we did not have it. But both of them are following the sonority principle. Okay. So it is important that you practice this because this is going to be on a future quiz. So what I'd like you to do for practice is to draw 2 diagrams for each one of these words. Remember, first, put them in IPA. Then I want you to draw a syllable tree showing the onset, the nucleus, and the coda, if there is one. It is a coda, because obviously open syllables don't have a coda. And then say whether it is an open or a closed syllable. And then I'd like you to draw a sonority graph like we just drew here for the words. And this will be good practice for the next test. And then I will post the answers on Canvas. Okay, so that's it for sonority.